I was closing up the cafe when I noticed them for the first time, a man and a little girl, huddled together on the bench across the street. It was freezing, and the man had wrapped his coat around the child, shivering in his worn-out sneakers. Something about the way he kept glancing over at the cafe lights made my heart twist. I hesitated. I wasn't in the habit of inviting strangers in, especially not after hours, but there was something different here. Maybe it was the girl's sleepy eyes, or the way the man didn't ask for anything, just sat in silence like he was trying not to exist. I stepped outside and crossed the street with 2 cups of hot cocoa in my hands. "Hey," I said softly, kneeling in front of them. "Would you both like something warm?" The man looked up, startled, as if kindness had become foreign. We're okay," he said, but his voice cracked. "I insist," I replied, handing the cup to the girl. Her fingers trembled as she took it, and she gave me a small, grateful smile. "My name's Mia," I added. "Why don't you come inside for a bit? Just until it warms up." The man hesitated. Then, finally, he nodded. Inside, I gave them some leftover pastries and a place to sit. The girl's name was Lily. Her father, Daniel, didn't speak much, just thanked me with a sincerity I wasn't used to. They stayed for maybe an hour. When I offered to let them sleep in the small storage room in the back for the night, Daniel looked like he might cry. I told him not to worry, just one night. That one night changed everything. That I laid out some spare blankets and a space heater in the storage room. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and safe. Lily curled up on a pile of clean towels like it was a luxury bed, her little arms hugging a stuffed animal I found in the lost and found bin. Daniel pulled me aside before I left for the night. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly, his eyes glossy. "Most people don't even look at us anymore." I shrugged. "You looked like you needed someone to." He gave a small nod. "Thank you, Mia. Really. I didn't ask what happened. Something told me he wouldn't be ready to share. But I did leave some food, bottled water, and even a phone charger before locking up. The next morning, I came in early. To my surprise, the storage room was spotless. The blankets were folded. The dishes washed. And Daniel and Lily were sitting at one of the tables. She was drawing with crayons I'd left behind the counter, and he was sipping coffee. "I hope it's okay we stayed a little longer," he said sheepishly. "Of course," I smiled. "Stay as long as you need this morning." He looked like he wanted to say more but stayed silent. I noticed he kept glancing at his phone, then at me, then back again. It was odd, like something was on his mind. Later that afternoon, just before closing, Daniel asked if I'd be around tomorrow. "I will," I said. "Why?" He hesitated. "Because I want to tell you something. About us. But I need to make a call first." I nodded, unsure of what he meant, but I had a strange feeling in my gut. Like something big was coming. I had no idea how big. The next morning, I opened the cafe early again. A storm had rolled in overnight and the streets were quiet, covered in mist and puddles. I wondered if Daniel and Lily had found somewhere else to sleep, or if they'd even come back at all. But just as I flipped the sign to open, I saw them approaching the glass door. Daniel looked different. His beard was trimmed, his clothes, while still simple, looked cleaner, newer. Lily was holding his hand and beaming like she had a secret. "Morning," I said, opening the door for them. Daniel nodded. "Can we talk?" I guided them to the same table as before, bringing over warm drinks. Then he looked me in the eye. "I wasn't honest with you," he said. I tensed slightly. "I wasn't trying to lie," he added quickly. "I just didn't know if I could trust anyone. But after what you did, I realized you deserved the truth." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small black leather wallet. Inside was an ID, not just any ID, but a corporate badge with his full name and a company I instantly recognized. One of the biggest investment firms in the country. You were a banker? I asked slowly. He shook his head. I was the VP of strategy at Winford Capital. My jaw dropped. He continued, 2 years ago, there was a hostile takeover attempt. I found evidence of internal fraud and tried to stop it. They buried it, and buried me along with it. Legal threats. Reputation ruined. I lost everything overnight. I stared at him, speechless. They thought I'd vanish. That I'd give up. But I've been collecting evidence ever since, and yesterday, I finally turned everything over to the right hands. My name is going to be cleared, Mia. And those responsible, they're about to face justice. I was stunned. Lily tugged my sleeve. Does that mean Daddy's not homeless anymore? Daniel smiled down at her. That's right, baby. Then he looked at me. And I wouldn't be here without you. I blinked, still trying to process. But why didn't you just tell me? Because I needed to know if kindness still existed, he said quietly. And you gave me more than kindness. You gave me hope. The rain outside had turned into a light drizzle, but inside the café, the air felt thick with revelation. I leaned back in my chair, staring at Daniel. So, what now? He smiled, but there was something unreadable in his expression. Now. Now everything changes. He reached into his coat pocket again, this time pulling out a folded document and a sleek envelope. He placed it gently on the table and slid it toward me. I hesitated before opening it. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note, to the woman who didn't ask for anything, but gave everything. And beneath the note, a check. I blinked at the number. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just a thank you. It was life-changing. No, I whispered. This is. I can't accept this. Yes, you can, Daniel said firmly. This is nothing compared to what I owe you. That night? You saved me and my daughter from losing hope. You didn't see a broken man. You saw a father. A little girl. You treated us like people. But this amount, I stared at the check again. This could buy me an entire building. Or open a second café, he said with a smile. Or take a break and travel the world. Do whatever you want, Mia. You've earned it. I looked at Lily, who was drawing hearts on a napkin. She waved at me and giggled. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I didn't do this for a reward. I know, he said. That's why you deserve one. He stood up, and for a moment I thought he was leaving. But instead, he extended his hand. I want to offer you something else, too. A job, not as a barista, but as a partner. I'm rebuilding my life, Mia. And I want people like you by my side. I stared at his hand, my heart pounding. The girl who had given shelter to a stranger the world tossed aside, now stood on the edge of something extraordinary. My hand hovered in the air for a moment before I slowly reached out and shook his. It felt surreal. Partner? With a man who once sat at the top of $1 billion company? I don't know what to say, I murmured. Say you'll think about it, Daniel said with a grin. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. Just then, Lily rushed over, her drawing in hand. This is for you, she chirped, holding up a crayon masterpiece of me, her, and Daniel standing in front of what looked like a giant café with hearts floating above it. I love it, I smiled. This one's going on the wall. Daniel laughed. She's already planning our future headquarters. That afternoon, they stayed for hours. We talked about everything, life before, life after. Daniel told me more about the scandal he exposed, and the legal storm that was about to hit Winford Capital. Within days, his name would be cleared publicly, and the media would eat up the story of the vanished executive who fought back. But in private, he kept repeating something that hit me deeply. I had nothing left but my daughter and a bag of clothes. I thought kindness was gone. You reminded me it wasn't. Later that night, I locked the cafe doors and stood in the middle of the room, staring at the check again. Then I looked at the drawing on the counter, the one Lily gave me. I didn't need to think anymore. The next morning, I called Daniel. "I'm in," I said. "Let's build something better, not just for us, but for people who get overlooked every day." I could hear the smile in his voice. "Welcome to something bigger, Mia." 2 months later, the cafe looked nothing like it used to. The walls had been freshly painted. The menu expanded. A new espresso machine gleamed behind the counter. But more importantly, every single seat was filled, not just with regulars, but with people who had once been where Daniel was. Because we didn't just renovate, we reimagined everything. Daniel and I had launched a new initiative, Second Sip. A cafe that didn't just serve food and coffee, but second chances. People coming out of shelters, veterans down on their luck, single parents with nowhere to go, we offered them training, jobs, and a community. And the response? Overwhelming. People didn't just come for the food, they came for the story. Word spread about the former homeless father turned investor, and the small-town girl who gave him a chance. News crews showed up. Social media exploded. But none of it compared to what I saw every day. Like Marcus, who had been sleeping in his car, now running the register like he owned the place. Or Elena, who hadn't smiled in weeks when we first met her, now baking cinnamon rolls that had customers lined up around the block. One day, Daniel pulled me aside in the back office. "I've been thinking," he said, looking out the window. "What if this isn't just a cafe?" I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "What if this is the start of something much bigger, a chain, a foundation, a whole network of places that give people the one thing money can't buy?" "Hope," I said quietly. He nodded. And just like that, the idea of expansion was born. But deep down, I knew the magic wasn't just in the business model. It was in the truth that changed both our lives. One act of kindness can rewrite a future. By the time spring rolled around, Second Sip had become more than just a cafe, it was a symbol. People came from other cities, asking how they could start their own branch. Daniel and I began working with community leaders and nonprofit groups to create a franchise blueprint, one built not just for profit, but for purpose. We opened our second location in a struggling neighborhood just a few miles away. And then a third, in a refurbished library downtown. Every location was staffed by people with stories, just like Daniel's. Just like Lily's. And just like mine. Because even though I hadn't lost a home or been cast out by a corporation, I had spent years believing I didn't matter much. That my little cafe was just that, little. Insignificant. Until I realized, the smallest act, done with heart, can echo farther than we ever imagine. One afternoon, I was wiping down a table when a woman walked in, maybe mid-40s, tired eyes, holding the hand of a young boy. She hesitated at the door, scanning the space like she wasn't sure she belonged. I saw her, really saw her, and I walked right over. "Welcome," I said with a smile. "Come on in. You're exactly where you're supposed to be." Tears welled up in her eyes. Later, she told me she had been living out of her car for weeks and was one bad night away from giving up. Until someone handed her a flyer that read, "Second Sip, where every story deserves a new chapter." That flyer saved her life. That flyer came from Lily. She had drawn it herself and taped it up at a bus stop. When I told Daniel, he just smiled and said, "Looks like my daughter's following in your footsteps." I looked at Lily, who was now helping in the kitchen on weekends, proudly wearing a miniature apron with "Hope Brewer" stitched in bright pink. And for the first time in my life, I realized, we didn't just give second chances. We built a place where miracles start small, just like us. The night before our 1-year anniversary of Second Sip, I stood alone in the cafe after closing. The lights were dim, soft jazz played from the speakers, and the air smelled like cinnamon and fresh brewed espresso. Photos of our staff, our family, lined the wall, people who had once been invisible, now smiling, thriving, shining. I walked over to a framed photo near the register. It was from our very first day. Me, Daniel, and Lily standing outside with coffee cups raised and goofy grins on our faces. None of us had known what was coming. None of us had expected the world to change. The bell above the door jingled. I turned, expecting it to be one of the cleaners, but it was Daniel, holding a small box in his hand. "You always work too late," he teased gently. I smiled. "Comes with the territory." He walked up to the counter and placed the box in front of me. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside was a necklace. A tiny pendant shaped like a coffee cup, with a heart carved into the foam swirl. "I had it custom made," he said. "To remind you, that sometimes, a warm drink and a kind heart can do more than any boardroom ever could." I laughed softly, touched in a way I couldn't explain. "You didn't have to, I wanted to," he said, looking at me seriously. "Mia, you didn't just change my life. You gave my daughter her future back. You reminded me who I was. And more than anything," he paused, then looked directly into my eyes. "You showed me what real wealth looks like." I felt the tears coming, but this time, I didn't hold them back. We stood there for a moment, silent. Grateful. Changed. Outside, the city kept moving. But inside our little café, a story that began with a cup of cocoa and a stranger on a bench had turned into something much, much greater. A legacy of kindness. A map for healing. A quiet revolution, one person at a time. The next morning, I woke up to a dozen missed calls. At first, I panicked, thinking something had gone wrong at the café. But when I checked the messages, they weren't from staff. They were from reporters. Daniel called just minutes later. "Turn on the news," he said, voice tight with disbelief. I flipped on the TV, and there it was, across every channel: whistleblower who took down Winford Capital identified, found building second-chance cafes across the city. The full story had broken. Not just about Daniel's fight against corporate fraud, but everything: how he'd lost everything, how he lived on the streets, how a stranger in a cafe gave him shelter, and how together we had built a new kind of empire, one powered by compassion instead of greed. The footage showed photos of me, Daniel, Lily. Second sip. Social media exploded. Hashtags trended. Donations poured in. Even celebrities and activists began reposting our story, calling it a blueprint for restoring humanity in a broken system. It was overwhelming. Beautiful. Terrifying. By noon, the cafe was packed beyond capacity, not just with customers, but volunteers, reporters, non-profit organizers, even city officials. People hugged each other at the door. Some wept as they looked around. Daniel and I barely had a second to breathe. At one point, a woman in a sleek suit stepped forward and asked for a word in private. She introduced herself as a representative from a global philanthropic foundation. "We'd like to fully fund your expansion," she said calmly. "Nationwide. And maybe, beyond." I stared at her. "Are you serious?" "We believe in movements," she said. "And what you've created. This isn't just a cafe. It's a model the world desperately needs." I looked at Daniel, who had just walked in from the kitchen. Lily was beside him, her cheeks flour-dusted, smiling from ear to ear. He met my gaze, and nodded. This was no longer just about one act of kindness. It was something far bigger than any of us had imagined. It was the beginning of a revolution. 6 months later, I stood on the stage of a grand auditorium in New York City, facing a crowd of thousands. Cameras flashed. Applause echoed off the walls. Behind me was a banner that read, "Second sip, one cup. One heart. One world." I took a breath and stepped up to the microphone. I was never trying to change the world, I said, my voice steady but full. I just saw a father and his daughter on a bench, and I couldn't walk away. The crowd fell silent. I didn't know he used to run a major firm. I didn't know he was being hunted by silence. I just knew that they looked cold. And hungry. And invisible. I paused, scanning the room. And I've learned something since that night, something simple, but powerful. The smallest kindness can break the loudest silence. The gentlest hand can lift the heaviest weight. And sometimes, when you open your door to someone in need, you unlock a future none of you could have imagined. I looked down and spotted Lily in the front row, clapping wildly with a giant smile on her face. Daniel sat beside her, pride written across his face. We had gone from one cafe to 47 locations in just over a year. Each one run by people with stories. Survivors. Fighters. Dreamers. And we were just getting started. After the speech, a little girl came up to me, barely 6 years old. She handed me a crayon drawing, just like Lily once did, of a cafe surrounded by hearts, stars, and people of every shape and size. I want to help people too, she said shyly. I knelt down to her level. You already are. As I walked backstage, Daniel was waiting. You were incredible, he said, pulling me into a hug. I looked at him and smiled. You think Lily will take over the company someday? She already thinks she owns it, he laughed. We stood there in silence for a moment, no words needed. Because we both knew something rare had happened. We had turned broken pieces into a mosaic of hope. From one moment of kindness, came a movement the world couldn't ignore. And it all started with a cup of cocoa, and a girl who chose to care. That a year later, the world had changed, or maybe, we had just reminded it how to care again. Second Sip was now in 6 countries. Schools used our story to teach empathy. Community centers requested starter kits. We'd even been invited to the UN to speak on the power of micro-compassion in global recovery. But some things never changed. I still opened our flagship cafe every Monday morning. Still brewed the first pot of coffee. Still chatted with customers who didn't know they were part of something historic. One rainy evening, as the last customers trickled out, I heard the bell above the door jingle. A man stood there, soaked from the rain, holding a child by the hand. He looked lost. Tired. Hesitant. I felt it, the same pull I'd felt the night I met Daniel. I stepped forward and smiled. Come in. You're safe here. His shoulders loosened. The little girl smiled. They took a seat by the window, where it was warm and quiet. As I poured them cocoa, Lily came over in her apron, now taller, more confident. She whispered, "He looks like Dad did when we met you." I looked at her and nodded. Then we know exactly what to do. Because this was more than just a story. It was a cycle of hope. And now, it was her turn to pass it on. The grand opening of our 102nd Sip location took place in New Orleans, the city Daniel once called home before everything fell apart. This time, we weren't just opening a cafe. We were unveiling something much bigger, the Second Sip Foundation. A non-profit branch dedicated to funding housing, education, and business training for people starting over. For those who never got a first chance, let alone a second. The mayor gave a speech. Local musicians played in the street. News anchors covered it live. But for me, the most powerful moment came quietly. After the ribbon was cut, Daniel, Lily, and I walked through the new cafe together, just like we always did. Lily, now a teenager, had her own set of keys and a title on the board. She had dreams of designing Second Sip schools across the country. At the back of the room was a memory wall. Dozens of framed stories from people who'd come through our doors, each one a living reminder that kindness could be more than just a feeling. It could be a force. Daniel leaned over and whispered, "This all began with a storm, and a girl who said yes." I turned to him, emotions welling in my chest. No, I replied. It began with a man who didn't give up, and a little girl who never stopped believing in him. We smiled at Lily, who was helping a nervous new trainee behind the counter, just like I once did. And as I stepped outside, feeling the breeze roll in off the Gulf, I realized something: we hadn't just changed lives. We had created a legacy. One act of kindness. One warm drink. One open door. That was all it took to start a wave that would carry the world. And it would never stop.